colleagues, welcome to this session, Land, Housing and Spatial Equality. I hope you enjoyed the morning session on the institution. I'm not going to spend much time introducing everyone as we need to get started already with our schedule. And I'm planning for one to know the fellow resident makers. Our resource person is Prof. William Barina in Registered Press Labs and King's College, University of Oxford. Welcome, Prof. We're very happy to have you here. Then we have our joint video presentation by Tabang Nkonyana and Dr. Ichapa Mape and Dr. Kirsten Korinko. And Bafana Gumede will be present the paper on snakes and people. Then we have Dr. Slale, Atletico Nguane, and Non Kumelelo. So welcome everybody, you've got your bios in front of you on our programs. Let's get started with Prof. Beinart. Over to you, Prof.
Looks like it just dropped
out.
out.
Yeah.
10 minutes ago.
He decided, no, he's leaving. We'll just give him a minute, otherwise we'll continue. But we need him for framing the conversation for us.
Could I suggest we go around the table and just introduce ourselves?
Yeah, that'll be great. Thanks.
So the rest of the
and let's do that, Cheryl. Yes. So I'm Arna Lawrence. I am the project manager at the Law Trust Chair. And yes, I had this conference been organising for quite a while. So we're happy to be here and to speak on this topic. Cheryl?
Yes, I'm Cheryl Walker and I'm at Stellenbosch University.
Chumagale Kosa is my name. I represent Zimbabwe Housing Group from Kayamani.
Actually, so my name is Jakob Baskako, who actually I'm from the Council General of the Russian Federation. We just received an invitation, so I received to visit it. Yes.
My name is Banzi Batman, and I'm also a student at Stellenbosch University.
Hello, I'm Datla Khongwane. I'm a lawyer. I specialize in agricultural law.
I'm Marita Pina, and I am a property law lecturer at the law faculty in Stellenbosch.
Welcome everybody. So I see we don't have him yet. Do you think, Dirkie, that you could maybe ask Megan to dial in, find out what happened, and then we'll have to otherwise continue with the joint video presentation. Maybe we'll start with that in the meanwhile, I think so. Yeah.
If I don't know if it's Megan or Dirkie who's starting the video, but if I could have just a minute to introduce who's speaking in the video before we start, because he wasn't able to join us today because of shack fire at the community.
Oh, okay. We're sorry to hear that. Yes, please, Kristen, continue.
Hello, can anyone hear me?
Yes.
We can, yeah.
Oh, thank you. I've been struggling with this for over 30 minutes.
Yes, we were the same. Sanjaba and I were so stressed and we're WhatsApping and talking. And
wow.
So are you going to start then for us, Kristen?
Okay, I just wanted to introduce before the video, you'll hear the voice of Tabang Nkonyana, who is a community leader in Kliptown, which he would describe as a ghetto neighborhood in Soweto. And he was not able to join us today because there were shack fire in the community yesterday. As well as a community leader, he's an extraordinary photographer and artist. And he and I have worked together for 9 years, and 3 years ago started an experimental collaborative called 1955. So if you could start the video, that would be great. Thank you.
Growing up in Cape Town is shanty community with deep rich history of the Freedom Charter draft. The community is divided by a metro rail line. Just at the upper part is the most famous and iconic, the Walter Sulu Square of Dedication. Just after the railway line, it's home, Sport, where all we are the same as it's a mixed community. Francis Alma The community stretches down to the edges where we meet the most powerful clip refuge. Growing up and surrounded by this powerful heritage and history was difficult and hurting. A ghetto without resources and facilities to play. You can't play next to the railway line. It's the most dangerous space to be have in your Zimbi. So the river is the perfect space, yet more dangerous with even more red tapes from the pig farmers, the church people, traditional healers, and the people who are planting, whom all use the river, some as a healing space, some as a sacred space. I want to mention my mom's weeping. The river is the place to be, especially during a hot sunny summer day. We have the older guys teaching us how to improve the secret was the most dangerous place to play in. Some stories of boys missing, even drowning, are flushed away by the most powerful river. The area is smooth, a long stretching landscape of green grass and reeds, channeling the community's edges. The soft, sweet sounds of the birds singing, forever robots moving slippery field. Years later, the community and the river both in danger, as industrial pollution is more visible. Chemical spills in the river, the forever deteriorating community buildings, the continuous lack of service delivery from the government, the waste from the community, the rubbish and plastic in the river, buildings are faulty, and the rising wetlands towards the community. The evidence is there, and more hating. The mutual respect and love is born, always mutual. On the latest visit to the river, I remember a joyful past and happy days. It is important to restart that friendship and visualize a working relationship between the river and the community. And hence our flood mitigation state park that will protect both the community and the river. The state park aims to make awareness about the river and teach the community the importance of the river, as well as the community protecting the river. Like that, the relationship can work both ways.
All right, so I'll come in here. Can you hear me all? All right, so this diagram is a metaphor for our working or our methodology as a team. Each of the chairs represents the different members of our teams, and some members of our teams sit further away from the table than other members. As you can see, the member of our team who's sitting on top of the table is the one who's got the most privilege and the most access. At the outside of the room is the river itself, which has got no access to the table. And our methodology really is talking about how do we close the space that defines the distance that each member has away from the table so that everyone has a seat at the table, including the river. Kristen?
Sanibonani, ngibonga kakhulu nongumema lapa namula. I'm a fifth-generation white settler living on traditional lands of the Secwepemc Nation in British Columbia, Canada. These lands were stolen without treaty through the land appropriation in the mid-1800s during colonization and remain unceded to this day. Thus, I am a squatter on these lands, yet I benefit from the intergenerational wealth of land ownership. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the ancestors and people of the Splatcheen, Nisconmouth, and Squilax bands for their ongoing inclusive activities towards healing and conciliation and the defense of the land, water, and winged, finned, rooted, and legged people. I also work in Johannesburg on the ancestral lands of the San and the Soto-Tuana people. I work in institutions in Canada and South Africa that teach and privilege content dominated by European canons of knowledge and colonial histories, and that exist in provinces deeply rooted in the ongoing economies of natural resource extraction. We are working on these social and planetary injustices but we have a long way to go, and I still remain the chair on the top of the table. One of the issues that Sechaba and Tabang and I have been discussing most recently is the idea of a class suicide, and expanding that to the idea of not just class suicide, but race suicide, gender suicide, and species suicide. We have a bias towards human-centric ways of, as architects for us, of ways of designing and ways in which we have relationship to the land. And in this case, as the diagram shows, the Rivers Chair that doesn't even have a seat at the table. Do you want to speak on that any further, Sechaba?
So yeah, so I think just to conclude our presentation, what we are working on currently is a flood mitigation scheme in Kliptown to try and mitigate the ongoing flooding of communities. And at the heart of our project is a way in which we can reestablish a relationship of some sort between the community and the river. And we're using this metaphor of a seat at the table to try and mediate the relationships of everyone on the team. Those who previously held positions of privilege are now asked to commit what we are calling professional suicide, borrowing from Amilcar Cabral. And, you know, we are also talking about things like species suicide, where our species-centric approaches are being questioned and challenged. And so this is a new kind of approach that we're taking on, and we would really much appreciate to hear feedback and views from everyone in this session. Thank you, everybody.
And I'd also just like to draw the connection, since the theme of restitution is the idea of restitution that expands to, you know, all the beings on the planet and the land, and how we bring that into our practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues. That was a beautiful presentation, and I think you were so spot on also with the river and the table imagery. When I was prepping my niece also for her story this morning, my life story, she was talking about this spatial inequality in terms of in Stellenbosch, the eerste river, that basically divides communities, and how water divides communities because water is so important. And I really think that this is what you did so beautifully in your presentation, and the whole thing of which chair is placed where, because that makes such a difference in access that we have to those things in life that will make us flourish. So I'm not going to speak much in between our presentations. We can discuss afterwards. I'm therefore going to ask Dr. Clark to do her presentation for us now, and then we will engage later on your presentations. Thank you. Nicole?
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name, am I showing on your side?
Yes.
Right. I had planned on doing a PowerPoint presentation, but I'm fine without it. So I was not in the room when everybody was introducing themselves. My name is Mpotlale, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Dean's Office at the University of the Free State. So I think a lot of stuff have been said about what restitution really means. It feels unnecessary, almost unnecessary, to continue with this presentation because I've learned so much from the previous presentation. I think my problem and many other academics is that we write behind the desk. We open books to examine what the problem is. And somebody who presented earlier was spot on when she said, we should work with communities as co-producers of knowledge instead of seeing them as research participants. So this engagement was really vital for me, and it shows that speaking to the people in practice enlightens one in ways that they can never imagine. So kindly, please let me know if you need a field researcher. I'm ready for the transition. In my mind, I believe that the greatest wrong in South African history is the land dispossession from people of color. So very briefly, how did we get here? Because we don't have enough time to go through the long history. This is what academics do for a living. They give histories and suggest possible ways forward. So very briefly, at one point it was legal to take away property of Black, well, let's say African people, because it covers a lot of groups in that word. So all non-white people were dispossessed of their land. Well, not all, but many. For convenience, through this presentation, a reference will be made to Black people, but it includes Africans, colors, and Indians. This dispossession was legalized through the Native Lands Act and the Groups Areas Act. The big question was why? It's also my belief that throughout this whole conference and the upcoming summit tomorrow, the question and many other social injustices will be addressed. Understandably, with the change of apartheid era in 1994, the incoming democratic government had the right to right the past wrongs. And one of the ways that was adopted was the land reform. So what is land reform? It is classified into 3 categories, namely land redistribution, land tenure reform, and land restitution. And it is this last leg of land reform that I allude to in this short presentation. When the Land Restitution Act was passed in 1996, it was meant to promote the principle of social justice by facilitating the right to restoration lost by displaced claimants. First, it had to return to those who had been forcibly moved from their homes in key urban areas. Secondly, to restore social justice. And thirdly, expand social and political agency to displaced citizens. However, from inception to date, has it achieved the objectives for which it was created? The issue is still debatable. I guess that's why we are all here. And then it also depends on who you're speaking to. Are you speaking to a parliamentarian, an African person, or a white person? I'll specifically deal with one of the dispossessed communities in South Africa. I chose the District 6 community for 2 reasons. I think it is one of the most recorded or documented histories of dispossession. Secondly, because it was in the middle of town in Cape Town, and it allowed outsiders and various races to seek refuge irrespective of their backgrounds. Over and above this, it was the birthplace of the living space of famous and celebrated artists, writers, academics, and notably Alex Laguma. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He was a novelist, a social activist, and a treason trialist, and journalist. I'm sure people who are in this field can name other people better than I can. Despite the injustices that were surrounding the residents, District 6 was a prosperous community where people made a life for themselves. However, this community and many like it were forcibly removed from their properties by the apartheid state, as highlighted earlier. Authors rightly compare the forced removals of District 6 to those occurred in Palestine and Israel. In as much as the circumstances might be different, but the lessons to be learned should be the same, I believe. So coming back to the issue of land restitution, the District 6 residents were promised to get a sorry, and I've learned before presentations that this was an acknowledgement. And this is a concept that I was not aware of before the earlier presentations. So they were promised a sorry from the state. They were therefore presented with the following options. They could either get their land back if it was available. They could get alternative land cases where the original land was not available. Otherwise, they could receive compensation for the less land. Lastly, they could get alternative relief, which could include a combination of the two of the mentioned types. Lastly, they will be given priority access to state resources. But was this enough work? Did it work? Because now we have the right to say, since 1996, when the Land Restitution Act was passed, we have a history to say whether this was successful or not. So where are we now? One of the many court rulings of the District 6 claimants declared that for those that chose to get the land back, their houses should be built in a haste. But as always, the numbers game is never accurate. However, let the record show that about 2,000 former residents or their children chose to get housed in their original property, while about 5,000 opted for compensation and 2,000 requested any dwelling in the case where their land was not available. So if 3,000 registered as lay beneficiaries, this led to an approximate value of 10,000 dwellings, 10,000 community members, sorry. And in as much as these promises were made through meetings and court rulings, the timing of the conclusion of the restitution has always been off. Just for an example, we're in phase 3 of 6 phases of the District 6 restitution community. It was supposed to be done by July 2022, but to date, there are still about 20 families who have not received their houses or any sort of compensation. While phase 4 and 5 are still to come, phase 4 promises a number of units. Phase 5, as always, will also give a number that it promises. But it just goes to show that timing is a problematic issue in the District 6 restitution process. Generally, we can say that the restitution process in District 6 has been painfully slow. And this is evidenced by the fact that from 2002, when the project first began, it was only in May 2022 when a little progress was noted after 2 decades of dispossession and suffering by the claimants. One of the reasons, remember, we're trying to find the weaknesses of why it's taken so long to give the people back what they want, either it's their land or compensation or a bit of both. One of the reasons, which is a huge problem, is that the restitution process is that there's endless infighting and litigation. As indicated earlier, there are about 20 properties that have withheld the completion of building restitution houses. However, the infighting is not always just between family members. It's even between the different institutions that seek to assist to end this injustice of dispossession. It is also important to note that the restitution program was from a larger landless population, hence it divided land claims because it had to be processed and distributed through the market, and this was only limited to those who had been dispossessed before 1913 when the Native Land Act was passed. Clearly, there were a huge number of people who lost their land before that period. And then moving on to the issue of compensation. Also, this morning taught me a lot about this issue of compensation. One of the excuse me? Is it just me hearing that? Should I continue?
We're hearing a lot of background noise.
Are they speaking English?
Excuse me?
Are they speaking English?
I have no idea. Can someone in the room try and find out? I think it's at the venue.
Yes, to present.
I don't know.
Okay. Okay, so it seems that Prof. Bainat, that we've just muted your microphone, we muted you. Because there was quite a bit of noise in the background there. Okay, Paul, you can continue. Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm giving you another minute, maximum 2.
But there is still that background audio behind.
Do you still hear it? We don't. Other colleagues, do you hear it, President? President, do you hear anything besides us?
Yes, I hear the background noise. And all of us seem to be muted except for Professor Reinhardt.
I think it's in one of the rooms that's hosting parallel sessions. The question is which one?
I think it might be the professors because you can see that there's sound. You looked at Extra's name, you can see that there's sound transmitting.
Prof. Bainat?
So we can no longer hear him.
Yeah, it does look like the sound coming from his side.
Is it possible for IT to mute him?
From Bainat? From Bainat, can you hear me?
Hello, can you hear me?
Professor Bainat?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Can you please mute your microphone because we're getting a lot of feedback from your end and the other speakers can't hear themselves.
If you can hear me, just let me know in chat. I've sent a... I'm not on mute.
No, Prof, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
I can hear you just about.
Can you hear me? Just
Oh, good. Shall I? Do you want me to go ahead?
not yet, Prof.
Please mute myself.
Not yet. We heard much noise from you in the background. Okay, you muted now, so Mpho will continue and just with her presentation before we go over to you.
Right. Okay, where was I? The compensation issue. So as I learned this morning, there is no amount of money in the world that can compensate what was lost to those who were dispossessed. However, it has been argued by many people, many of which are kindly joining us today, there exists a slight possibility that the restitution program could have been erroneous and should have rather been replaced with cash compensation. But then again, the big question is, will this approach solve the dispossession quagmire? And as much as compensation may have important symbolic value, the extent to which it makes any significant contribution to poverty alleviation is debatable. And in the same light, when people were forcibly removed from their land, it was not only the land that they lost their dignity, they lost social bonds, cultural sources, skills, hope of sense, of belonging and sense of security. And so please know that the intention was not to just point out the weaknesses or the entire failure of the restitution program, especially in regards to the District 6 community. I just wanted to highlight what went wrong as a country because clearly something is not right. And this issue has been beautifully laid by preceding presentations as I've noted. And so in moving on, it's also important to note that the busyness of the restitution state organs might be a contributing factor. Just as an example, I won't go into details about any of this. In District 6 projects, there exist the bodies such as the District 6 Working Committee, Regional Land Claims Commission, Social Housing and Land Restitution, the City of Cape Town, Western Cape, Department of Human Settlements, Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. Of course, we don't have enough time to go into each organ, but clearly, with the introduction of any new organ, whether a state, local, or within the claimant's organizations, there's bound to be a problem, either with the lack of information or clashes between the bodies that I've just listed now. Therefore, as many academics rightly argue, celebrating the numbers game does very little to restore the dignity. We must right the wrongs of the protracted and brutal land dispossessions, marginalization, and flagrantly disregard of those rights. Providing substantive redress has been suggested because it goes beyond the symbolic return of the land or payment of compensation. It further ensures that the lives of the victims are meaningfully reconstructed as envisioned in policy documents concerning District 6. Simply put, there are just too many groups involved in the District 6 project. Therefore, proposals have been made that instead of the local and national government officials having to deal with separate groups within the District 6 community, it should work with the current revamped bodies of the District 6, which are mainly society-based, not at a national level. Let the communities deal with their own problems and then present them to the state or whoever is funding the development or the restitution projects that they want to happen on their community land. While the restitution program has been while it has broadly achieved its symbolic or procedural objective of providing some form of compensation to victims of land dispossession, this has not shown any meaningful redress for past injustices. Substantive redress seems to be a better option because it puts emphasis not just on compensating the claimants by returning a piece of land, but it gives meaningful restoration of the victim's dignity and sense of justice. As hinted earlier, when people were dispossessed of their land, it was not just a material loss they suffered. They lost dignity, social bonds, resources, skills, hope, and other qualities. And one of the people who was notably quoted, who was a resident of the District 6 community, said that you can take, open quotes, you can take people out of District 6 openly, I was advised, this means in Old Pal in Afrikaans, but you'll never take District 6 out of the heart of the people. This shows a really close connection between the people of District 6 and their property, their land, anything that's related to their community property. So in as much as some beneficiaries are happy that their dignity was restored through the return of ancestral lands, some remain bitter, angry, disillusioned, and confused because the restitution cases are characterized by incompatibilities between what beneficiaries want or are capable of. Instead, it is about the state. It's about what the state policy stipulates. For example, to get funding from the state, beneficiaries need to draft business plans with mentors, which are usually agro-business orientated. This also goes to show that redress requires that efforts are made to meaningfully restore the victim's dignity and sense of justice. A broader conceptualization of land restitution program in South Africa should put emphasis not only on finalizing land claims, but it should also ensure that the process leads to the reconstruction of claimants' lives. And it is against this background that I guess we go back to the compensation debate. In as much as there is no one way.
I'm going to ask you to wrap up. Thank you.
Yes, I'm wrapping up. This is the last page. There is no one way to suggest that this battle of social injustice can be won. We can only attempt to ensure the respect for equality and other human rights for all. And many academics believe that, have suggested the restitution was a mistake and must be closed with cash compensation. And since the state officials have concentrated on clearing the backlogs of claims, and they ignore the beneficiaries after the resettlement. So is there hope under the land restitution bill? Is there hope under all the other new documents that are being presented, especially with regard to the District 6 community? I don't think so, but I guess this is why we are all meeting up here to see if there are ways forward to practically and not behind the desk, as I have done almost all my academic life, get to know the people, get to understand their real feelings, get their input on what is happening on the ground so that you understand clearly what it is that they have lost. That is all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Bo. Much appreciated. So obviously, it's important for us to talk about these grassroots organizations, but as you say, if there's infighting or ended infighting there as well, and then we have the institutional angle as well as the solution. So I think this is definitely something that we need to talk about further. And I'm sure we've got the involved housing group and the Timakere as well. We had a meeting yesterday specifically also over these issues and the processes that has to be gone through, and not just admin processes, institutional processes, funding, etc. So that is something we can maybe touch on later. Prof. Beinart, eventually we're going to give you your chance. Can you unmute yourself? Prof. Beinart? Okay, maybe you can.
No.
Oh, he's coming.
There's about a 10-second delay.
Oh, okay. Okay, Prof, over to you. Who is the guy in the background with you?
Hello.
Can you start?
Hi, I'm sorry. Could you do anything in chat? I can't hear.
And we got a noise from your side as well in the background.
I think his connection is extremely bad because I was watching the visual earlier and it was very, very bad. So I think the feedback from us is not going through as clearly as we can hear him.
Okay, Prof, we're first going to continue with some of our other participants and see if you could maybe sort out the noise in your background. So Katlego, there you go. Katlego is with us. Over to you.
As been said, my name is Katlego. I'm a lawyer that specializes in agricultural law. And basically what that means is that all my clients are farmers, either big agri-commercial clients or your smaller farmers running your mid-sized businesses. And what I've found and why this topic is very interesting to me is that there's one group that I found is probably most vulnerable in the country because we are very quick to identify the fact that land has been dispossessed in the past, for people of color. But everybody's forgotten about farm workers or former farm workers because actually these people have not been dispossessed of any land, they've always lived there because the beginning of their journey or the reasons why they are on certain properties or on farms is because they originally went there as laborers. And what we found now is that with the passage of time, with young people not wanting to farm and not wanting to take over the farming businesses or the farmland of their parents or grandparents, they're selling. And in order to sell your property, most owners, new owners want vacant occupation because they want to be able to use the land as they want and they do not want the stress of having to deal with 80, 100 people that live on a farm that do have rights. So I'm not saying that farm workers are not protected by law. Of course, we have the ESTA Act, we have all sorts of legislation that protects them, especially vulnerable old people that have now retired or are disabled or whatever the case might be. But the fact still remains that when we have change and somebody wants to sell their farm, they are very determined to get rid of them regardless of the situation there. What we've also found in my firm is that then the question is, where do they go? So having to deal with these type of cases of possible evictions or trying to figure out what's happening is that when you speak to the farm workers or former farm workers, I say former farm workers because not all of them are necessarily working on the farm, they just live there. And they've lived there 5, 6 generations. It's one family, 50, 60 years of living there. When you talk to them, you find that they're too scared to join the so-called urban edge. They're not interested in an RDP house or to live in a township or to live near to a town, only because culturally, this is all they know. And this goes beyond whether they're black, colored. It's got nothing to do with actual race. It's more to do now with that particular community and the sort of social systems they've developed as farm people or people that live in a farm. So here for me, the challenge of the inequality that we seem to have forgotten this group of people that they don't even have land. And the land was never theirs to begin with. It was through, the relationship they have with the farm owner. But then when that changes, what do we do and how do we protect it? And that in itself is an injustice that's currently happening. And then it almost borders the restitution story that we are talking a lot about the past and how we fix the past into the future, but we currently still have an issue of people that are being unfairly treated. And where it's not managed and it's not my particular client, I don't know what happens to those people. We've heard horrendous stories all over the country of farmers abusing these people to get them off, all sorts of things, poisoning of dogs, using bulldozers to get them off and scaring them. But, for a firm like mine, we try to find models and solutions where we don't go run into the court immediately for court evictions. We try to educate the farmer and the farm workers to say, listen, you are a property owner, so you have your rights as a property owner. But then also farm workers, they have their rights as well. And we have to find a middle ground between the two. And I'm proud to say that in some ways we have. So one of the examples of the solutions that my firm has come up with is that we've gone and spoken to government about it, that you guys forgot the farm workers. You know, you're so obsessed about RDPs and this and this and that. What about the farm workers? And we found that we can say to the client, fine, can you pay for a house for them? And human settlement is actually willing to say, we will get them on the list and off the list if you give them title, you know, because it helps the government be able to get through the list quicker without the responsibility or the burden to find land. Because as we know, the issue with the RDP is not the budget, it's actually finding the land to put these RDPs on and build them. So that's one of the solutions that we came up with, and we built a strong relationship with human settlements to say, where's the compromise? And that way our farmers don't feel like they've been cheated in spending too much money on buying a house because they have to by law, because then we give them back that discount from the government to say, well, here's the 140 that we're going to spend on this family anyway for the purpose of an RDP. But we are still very far away from getting it right. And I worry that nobody ever thinks of these particular people that cannot be easily moved into the township, into towns, into Stellenbosch, because they don't want to. You know, they're worried about crime. So they have the same fears as suburban people actually. You know, they're scared about crime, they're scared about drugs, they're scared about all sorts of things that a farm does give them, because they are so far removed from society that it is only them and they can form their own customs and rituals. So in short, because of time, I would like to, you know, hear opinions from all of my colleagues here about that, and has that been given thought? You know, when we talk about restitution and equality, that we have people also in the present that need protection of government, of legislation, of community, you know, because I live in Paarl, we live in Stellenbosch, we're surrounded by beautiful farms, but do we ever give some thought to what makes this place beautiful, and where are the people that work here or live on these farms? Because we know they exist, we just don't see them, you know, but they are there. So I think when we have the opportunity to discuss and to debate, that would be sort of the thoughts I want to sort of put out there, because I realize, you know, everything that has been spoken about this morning, it's all good and I fully agree, but I'd like to say, what about the farm workers? You know, what about those people that, you know, have never been moved from anywhere, they've always been there. You know, yes, I think that sort of sums up my perspective on it, and what I'd like us to discuss with them.
Okay, I'm trying to colleagues, I think that is also one of our discussion points, is how we to think about this type of model, and what you can maybe also expand on a bit further, is when you deal with government, how do you do it, and how do you get to a point of resolution, if I can put it like that, because we all know what it is to deal with, red tape and bureaucracy and so forth. So that to me would also be an interesting point to get across in order to get to the solution. Then I'm going to ask first that we will continue with Nompumelelo. Is Nompumelelo here? Because I didn't see Nompumelelo online either. So then maybe, okay, let's try Prof. Beinhard for a last time, Prof. I'm so sorry, but if we cannot establish a connection, it's kind of difficult. Cheryl, that you have him on the phone, because otherwise we can try and dial you in to talk on the phone. You know, we have got him on WhatsApp. Huh?
Can you hear? Can you hear me now? I can hear you slightly.
We do, yes, slightly, but we can hear you.
So just let me know if I should carry on and talk, but I have been able to hear what other people have said. I'm sorry.
Please continue, Prof.
Please continue. Okay. So I was asked to do a broad background on land restitution. Restitution was introduced as one of the first acts of the ANC government in 1994, but it's important to emphasize that it was initially aimed specifically at restoring land removed by forced removals after the 1913 Native Land Act and the entrenchment of segregation and apartheid. So this cut-off date was central in the minds of the legislators. It wasn't intended to be conceived or to recreate pre-colonial societies. Restitution was almost by definition a more limited process. Looking back now, the Presidential Commission on Land of 2019 reckoned about 3.5 million hectares being transferred from wildlife by this route. That's about 3% of all land and 4% of agricultural land, which in fact more or less was predicted at the start. And financial compensation has been paid for perhaps 2 million more hectares. But it's important to emphasize that restitution was not the main redistributive policy for land. It led to a larger total percent of agricultural land being transferred. And of course, in the urban areas, rather than restitution per se, although there were some very important cases of restitution. So restitution was symbolically important, but not the main redistribution. Where should restitution policy go now? It's very controversial and difficult. About 80,000 cases have been settled, but perhaps 6,000 to 7,000 remain. I think the government's first task is to settle those that remain by devoting adequate resources, which they haven't done. The second is to ensure that recognized claims are implemented and supported with legal and agricultural backup. Just one example, I was involved in Xolweni, Bizana, Eastern Cape. 10,000 hectares were awarded by Judge Bam in 2009. But control remained so disputed by the local chief and CPA that development is static. The state has to lead in completing such processes. There are many. In 2014, a Land Restitution Amendment Act was passed by President Zuma's government. Though it was struck down by the Constitutional Court in 2016, 160,000 claims were apparently made, some perhaps opening up the pre-1913 cut-off date, and some related to betterment or forced villagization, the policy pursued in the form of Pakistan's unmade. Both, I think, if opened up, would have repercussions for extensive legal cases and multiple claims. I also think that restitution has not been really a vehicle for successful agricultural production, and reopening a very wide range of claims together with expropriation without compensation legislation may discourage investment in a relatively buoyant economic sector. So that land reform should ideally proceed by the different routes, by redistribution, which was always intended as the main route, with agricultural investment as a priority, with the strict state drawing on commodity organizations, NGOs, private sector, which are increasingly contributing. And in the urban areas, of course, housing and services remain fundamental. So those are my questions and a sort of an argument.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you very much for summing it up for us. So I think what we're going to do now is to open the floor for questions and discussion. I think it's a good idea for us to then go a little bit over the time, if you don't mind. So let's say we've got 15 minutes. Yeah, and I'm going to open up the floor. Our colleagues who started with the joint video presentation, as you said, you would also like to engage on that further. Then we will discuss models, as Katlego had also asked us to do. We will talk about the District 6 issue, grassroots organizations. How do we pull that better into the institutional framework? So yeah, opening the floor.
I just have a question for Kasia. She mentioned this concept of saving, I'm not sure if the workers or government, a specific sum of amount. Can you like take us through that again, like very, very simply, because it sounds very interesting.
So basically how it works in terms of human settlements, everybody has a right to put their name down for an RDP, for free housing, right? So that's not discriminatory, it's just a government thing, which is great. However, the government has a budget for all of that, but they don't have land, right? So depending on where we are in the country, some places just do not have land. So let's use Western Cape, for example. It's a big issue to find where you're going to put RDP, because you have to consider about services, you have to consider, planning and all of that, because we're in a very agricultural space as well. So it's not that easy to take, let's say, a portion of Washington, but turn it into, a township or whatever it is. So there's a lot of considerations, a lot of legislation that will determine where you can have it. In the meantime, it means that the government is stuck. They can't build anything, so nothing's going to happen, and then you've got this long list of 1 million people on this RDP. So then we came along a few years ago and we said, right, if we can get our clients, the farmers or the white farmer, to agree to, and if we can get the farm workers to relocate, for example, so off the farm into the urban edge. I say urban edge just meaning anywhere outside of sort of agriculture and, into towns, townships. If we can agree to do so, can we have an agreement with the farmer to say we will give them title? So there's no strings attached, there's no other contract to say, well, you owe me because I bought your house, whatever. It's title, right, of the person. Then we approach human settlements to say, we're going to buy this person a house, it's going to cost us 250,000. What is your budget for, let's say, the Stellenbosch area? They might say, yes, it's 180,000 rands per RDP. Then we say, okay, fine. If we then build the house, we find a plot, someone to put them, we build the house, it's there, we give them a title deed, and then you can prove it to human settlements that there's a title deed for this person, and this person was on the RDP list. Obviously, they can't get 2 houses. So then that person automatically gets cancelled off the RDP list, but the money is still there technically. So the deal we've made with human settlements is that then give us the 140, right? Then the client has fulfilled their duty in terms of the law, in the sense that you can't just give people they feel of rights, they're protected by ESTA, right? But at the same time, you haven't lost out, you don't feel cheated, because the government met you halfway, halfway or 2/3 of the way in terms of cost, right, of that. And we found that that's far more palatable to our clients than saying to them, you owe them a house. So you have to buy them a house, so you have to do this. And I think a lot of the times I find farmers, white farmers especially, feel like everything is their fault, so they have to pay. And a lot of people feel like that's what restitution is, and it's not. I argue that restitution is about finding a balance, right? So understanding that equality needs to happen. There must be a way to equal the playing field. So you are responsible if you have privilege and you've benefited from the past. But it's not completely your fault or completely your responsibility. So we find that they're more open to the conversation, like and say to them, listen, the government is going to meet you halfway. You're not paying for this completely out of your own pocket. You will get 140, 100, whatever the RDP budget is in a particular place. And then they find it easier and they find it more balanced. Because they also get what they want, which is people off their farm for their own safety, or the fact that they want to sell the farm. And I mean, now in the Western Cape, we're seeing a lot of estates come up. Farm living is quite a big thing in the Western Cape. A lot of farms are being turned into luxury lifestyle estates, and people are not farming anymore. But you need people off. You can't have people, So that's basically how it works. And we found that the government is very willing to have those conversations if we give certain guarantees. So I don't just go there and say, well, those guys said you will. It's agreed, it's everybody's happy, and then there's it.
So I'm wondering with that college, with the longland development, for instance, if I saw that the municipality had handed over houses there as well to do it, and I know it was also a huge story there to remove people from the land for development purposes. So do anybody know whether the same type of thing happened there? Do you know anything about that? No. Yeah. Any further questions? Colleagues, I don't see anything here in the chat box. Yes. Hero?
There's a lot
of fantastic.
And I'm also thinking of tomorrow's panel. I don't know how many of us will be part of that as well. But I think one is the question of institutions that has come up. We came up with the District 6 story, and we've also, William raised it. I mean, you're also raising it in terms of, we've got a private law firm involved in human settlement, so it's, which is, I don't know how many cases you've been able to settle. And there's several comments here. One is the tension between doing stuff at scale, especially when we've got such a huge backlog of old claims, never mind the ones that are sitting. But how you also craft settlements that are fair and robust and bring some sense of closure, at least to the claimants, because you often are also dealing with generations and things that you can't control in terms of how they might regard the settlement. So that's a question, and it's. I mean, William, you spoke about strengthening the commission, and before you spoke about the sort of the community-based organisations, I think, as that those are the two key ones, and I think they are key. But so with community-based ones, we know that there are often lots of problems with, leadership conflicts and different views, actually. It's not that this necessarily. So that's how do we mediate that, and that was certainly the case, I think, in District 6, with different claimant groups coming up, different representatives. But the commission can't do everything on its own either. It's not equipped to handle housing, to look at plans. So we do need multi-institutional settlements, it seems to be, and what is the best combination, I suppose,
Sorry, can I ask a question? I'm interested to ask, like, because one of the things that Sechab and Tabang and I have looked into is the sort of legal rights that land is given, so that land begins to actually be a stakeholder in these kind of conversations. And I'm wondering if you see that at all in the legal profession. For example, we see this happening in other countries, such as New Zealand and Ecuador, although many of the constitutional changes that were made in Ecuador to give land legal rights as a human, equivalent to a human being, have since been negated by the next political leaders. But I'm just wondering, is there any conversation at all in South Africa about this issue of giving land and elements within the land legal rights that are equivalent to the rights of a human being?
I personally have not had or heard of those conversations, no conversations like that. I mean, certainly over my dinner table with clients, I bring up the conversation to say, well, we're not thinking about that. And I think, our whole thing also the firm is, as much as possible, we stay out of the politics of the day, or what is still being discussed, whether it comes to expropriation or whatever the case might be. We work really within what we understand and what we know, which is sort of the legal framework and how we can manipulate it if we can to get the results, for our clients, and also to try to be fair also to the farmer and take into consideration the history of this country and the past of this country. And like I said earlier, I find that with those conversations amongst our clients and the farm workers, we find that they are open-minded to it if someone just sort of breaks it down, instead of coming with an aggressive way of saying, oh, you must do this, or you owe people this, or whatever the case might be. Because I think, to be fair, anybody coming into my business, for example, with that type of attitude, I will become defensive and I will shut down. So we find that the open conversation about land, what it actually means, what it means to somebody to have own title, because I mean, obviously, one of the ways I explain to my clients is that when you give somebody title, you're giving them, an instrument that they can negotiate with now. They've got something, and also the farm worker then also understands it better, because I say to them, look, you can fight with me and say you don't want to leave the farm, this is your house, you were born here and all of that, but at the end of the day, it's not your land, it's not yours. You can never transfer it, because even the current legislation that protects farm workers, it only goes to a limit. It's not some people have a life right to live and die on the farm, but it's not your family, your children and your children's children, And once you start explaining that to them, that you are better off with something actually that you do actually have, that you can pass on to your children or your grandchildren and can never be taken away, then that's a whole different conversation. And like I say, we stay away from the politics or the current conversations around it, because it's complicated, as we've spoken this morning. There's a lot of elements to it, so we just work within where we can and how we can manage it with the conversations we're having.
Juanita, you could also maybe add to that.
Yeah, maybe just a further response to that. We still have the model where land is the object, never the carrier of the right, but the object of the right. But we did have a major thrust last year to actually take away land from private control and to place it under state custodianship. But that was then unsuccessful when the vote didn't carry in December last year in the attempt to change the property clause. So instead of making land the carrier of rights, we have been doing exactly the opposite, Kirsten. So we haven't ventured in that direction that some of other jurisdictions with similar colonial histories have done. My other comment that I wanted to make was Cheryl highlighting the different role players. Very important, all different role players, but they have to function within a framework, unfortunately. And a framework is there, not only legislative framework, but also policy and departmental directives. And in that regard, we have had that Amendment Act that was struck down in 2016. We still don't have a new act, even though government did have 24 months to draft a new act, and they then applied for the extension. The Constitutional Court handed down a judgment in 2019. And then there was also a personal cost order made against the former minister regarding the district seats. So, yes, I think we must really rope in and harness the goodwill and the competencies and the capabilities of people, but unfortunately there is a legal framework that is overarching and that has an impact on what we do and how we do it.
Just want to comment on that.
Could I just say something? I'm just wondering if, I don't know, just thinking, is there a link, do you suppose, to between restitution and the differing worldviews of land as a commodity and land as sacred? And is there work potential, or I don't know what even the right dynamic to name is, but when we talk about working within the legal frameworks and so on, those are colonial land ownership, and in light of the meanings of restitution we've been talking about in this conference, of is there room to talk about the land as sacred as it was to many of the people who and cultures who lived both here in Canada and there in South Africa before colonial contact?
Sorry, can I respond to that specifically? So what I've seen is that in terms of land rights per se and the rights that vest in individuals, I have not seen the distinction between land being sacred and not sacred, but I have seen it in matters like with Kalobeni and with communities involved, except the focus is not so much on the rights in the land, but the biocultural rights, this new notion that the communities are the safeguard, they're the guardians of the land, they have a special relationship with that specific land. So it's not to say that the land is sacred, but it's to say that the relationship maybe that the community has with the land, whether they have formal rights in that land or not. I have found that to be very interesting. So I think it has been a way of almost diverting from the more doctrinal understanding of land rights, but still the notion that you do have that sacredness of land in your relationship. Sorry, Professor.
No, me. I just wanted to pick up on the same issue. I mean, I think it's the sacred nature of land gets invoked in different kinds of contexts and questions around heritage. But the issue of land as having rights, it has been, I think, it comes up in terms of its conservation value. So it's, I'm thinking of the St. Lucia camp that I was involved in, which was taking place at the same time as District 6, where it was the sort of so this was seen as particularly valuable land from a conservation biodiversity point of view, and that gave it a kind of status, but it's not the same, as the land of the Klip River, for instance, where it would not be seen as being a sort of having conservation value. And I think that's an interesting point that you are. How do you think about that? Because I would say generally land is seen as, whether it's through a title or through a community, it's a sense of people's rights over it are stronger than the land having its own rights.
Yeah. But that's interesting is what role does what comes in.
At this stage, the first comes out.
Yeah.
Colleagues, I have nothing to add. I'm just agreeing with everything that we're saying. Like I said when I started the presentation, there is no one correct way to say this is how we should right the wrongs. But it's important to consider all the stakeholders or all the victims, all the future generations. Just put everything in mind when you try to fix what was broken. So I may come up with option A until we go up to the letter Z, but as long as those can find common ground, as long as they don't clash, then we have a solution. Whether it's 100 solutions or 2 solutions, as long as we find common ground in righting the wrongs of the past.
Thank you, Magna, and greetings to all of us. And what I want to contribute to this discourse, for instance, is the question of land restitution. In my mind, and also I think in everybody's understanding as far as the Constitution is concerned, shouldn't be divorced from the other two components of the land reform. That is the land redistribution as well as the land tenure reform. Because the question of restitution has to do with what has been already explained, but how do you then restore the sense of dignity to those people? If, for instance, people were taken from the central town of Stellenbosch and placed elsewhere, and bulk of their generation now is packed in the smaller backyards of those new settlements that they were possibly removed to. So in order for you to address that problem, you need to identify new portions of land. New portions of land that can be identified in order to develop new communities. The sense of township, for instance, that Katlego is kind of making reference to, it's something that has been, I think, made reference to by other speakers previously, to say that even the concept of township is not a concept that has been designed and developed by black people and majority of people who are beneficiaries of that. But those people are finding themselves conditioned, constrained, and placed in those townships. Now, if you want to change the dynamics, you need to put up some innovative kind of opportunities that invites everybody. And by everybody, we mean the ordinary community people, paired and also integrated, working collaboratively with the academics that are having expertise in as far as leading and making input in as far as developing and designing a new sense of community. So you deal with the kind of the restoration of the dignity that has been lost, but at the same time you give them the opportunity of reclaiming that which identifies with their cultural heritage, whatever they want to reclaim as far as that is concerned, they have the opportunity to do so. But the question of leadership and the question of political will comes to play. Because we have the constitution, and part of, for instance, the issues that Professor is referring to when she talks about the property clause, section 25 of the constitution, that has fallen away in their effort to reform it. Now the question is, you already have provisions for the expropriation in the constitution, but then they are not doing anything in as that issue is concerned. So the issue of implementing some of the policies that are already in place comes to question, because we lack the competency, we lack the kind of resources that we have already there, limited as they are not being used optimally to address some of these problems. So the question of mobilizing and organizing communities, question of building strategic partnerships and collaborations becomes very, very important. So working together with people who are like Tlelpo and other people in the Gauteng area, combined with people here in Stellenbosch, for instance, who are also organized and who are also divided by rivers, railway lines, and etc., etc. So those people can, I think, if they are given an opportunity and also supported by necessary funding, can kind of lead us to a new way of resolving issues in South Africa without looking and relying on political and political will of the authorities.
Hi, may I please? Oh.
Yes, we could give you a final word. I'm sad to say almost. These sessions are always too short because we actually already almost have to go in, or we have to go into, according to the program, into feedback. So, yes.
Okay, no, I will be quick. I just said I think we need to think about climate change in conversations like this, because today's land restitution could be tomorrow's landslide. And to me, climate justice has to be at the heart of discussions about land reform. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
No, I think that's good. And then I feel, I don't know if we've touched enough on spatial inequality that causes non-access to services, to anything. Just from a quick personal perspective, I was in Philippines and armed robbery on a project 3 months ago involved. And obviously it was a terrible thing, but we were helped. The police eventually escorted us out. Cyber security was there, and I could go back. So this is just like kind of the final statement. I could go back to Stellenbosch and to the safe space because of where I come from, because of, face it, my skin color, my history, my privilege, and I could exercise the choice to say I'm not going back there. I stated it, and you know what, the police station in Philippi closes at 8 o'clock at night. Because it's so dangerous, so they use their resources to escort us out, and I saw another side of the police, by the way, that was just so caring and fantastic in this horrific experience. So in my mind is, I could do that, but what of our colleagues in the first place, our students, and the rest of the community that live there, whether it's men, women, children, part of my research, like Prof said, is on sex workers. They criminalize, they've got access to nothing. They can't, if something happens to them, where do they go? Because of spatial inequality. So how has restitution helped them? So I don't really know whether we've got an answer here to that.
I just want to add on that, because you said something very important, that at least you have the privilege of going back to Stellenbosch and going to that city. Because I come from Khayelitsha, so
Yeah.
it's like a taxi away from where we live, in Res,
Yeah.
and I live in an informal setting, and obviously that luxury from there, I can feel it, like I can feel the emotional shift when I go home, that I have to actually register in my mind that I'm not safe, and that if I go to the police, I will not be attended to. If I fall sick the very next day from coming from Res, I know I'll be sitting in the clinic from 4 o'clock right up until 2 o'clock, and that's the only time I'll get attendance. And that's if the doctor is actually in the mood and the nurse is actually in the mood to take my trip. So I think what's very important in that is something I raised with my constitutional law lecturer, and it's something the Constitutional Court does, and it's called a structural indictment, whereby the Constitutional Court actually says to government, you have done wrong to this person in this way, but we're going to hold you accountable. And of course, there's many arguments of the fact that it does inflict on trias politica, but if the actual constitution actually did more of those, I think we could be heading in some form of the right direction, because they implemented it in the Komape case, whereby a child sort of like finding the toilet at school, and the government was like, cannot afford this, and therefore they're going to follow up. It's basically structural constitutional remedies, whereby it's not just a remedy, but rather holding them accountable. So you said something very interesting.
Okay, thank you. Don't need to remember all that. Yeah, I think it's the compounded, it's realizing what the compounded effect of it is. And for me, ultimately, it starts at home. Doesn't it start at home with what we teach our children, how we teach them, and how they see other people, how they see inequality and poverty, and understanding that whole thing of if you are 5 minutes late and your housekeeper cannot leave and misses a taxi and everything that happens after that, because this is what happened to my housekeeper's friends. I think it was the daughter that was in, because they were late, abducted from the play area and they found her murdered in the field. And this all has to do, for me, with restitution, with what have we done, and how do we remember and understand this is the effect of our actions, of what we do, how we see, who we let in, you know, and it's not that question of that we now have less. It is shifting the boundaries. Just needs letting more people in. That is kind of my final thing. And I said, yes, and I'm saying it from my research. I'm not a land specialist, but I experienced this whole thing for the first time in my life with that thing that happened. I clicked what spatial inequality means. And it was like a thing that dropped in me. But I had to, how bad is it that the human affliction is that we first have to feel and experience? Or am I wrong? But that is kind of, we first almost have to feel another person's pain in order to know what it is to lose something. To know what it is. We also as a family lost, lost everything 10 years ago, our home, our cars and everything. So I lost a home. So I understand what you say to want to own something again, something that is yours. No,
Sorry, I don't know if you just want to take
sorry, colleagues. And I was, yes, last question with my back to you.
I just see he's had some notes here.
Okay, yes. We have to think about, we have to think about climate change when we have these conversations today. Land restitution can be tomorrow's landslide. Yes. And climate justice has to be at the heart of this discussion going forward. So this is maybe then something that we can add as part of our feedback to continue the conversation tomorrow at the summit. Because remember, so we want you to also be in the panels as much as possible tomorrow, because tomorrow we also very much more focus on policy making and civil society, government, legislation, etc. So to move from our theoretical and academic discussion to actual work on the ground. Okay, colleagues, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so colleagues, now you can please go back to the main stage for us. For the feedback session. You know how to do that? Megan, then you guys have.
But can I click on the stage?
So you just click on the stage button that says live.
On the left hand side. Right,
So we go, then I ask you to do the feedback for us.
Sorry, I tried to get him to put on the aircon and unlock the door and everything, and then I got stuck in there.
Good job.
The things I had to do for the chair.